Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Acacia Fimbo. I'm the events producer here at the Research Forum in the Courtauld, and it's wonderful to have so many of you with us this evening. Tonight's event is the third in the Considering Collecting series, which is kindly supported by Lawrence C. Zale Associates Incorporated, a visual arts advisory company. The series looks at the many different facets of collecting, both historical and contemporary, including what inspires people to collect, the impact of technology on collecting, the roles of women as dealers and collectors, and the future of public art collections. We're looking at a wide range of collections of all types and sizes, from individual private collections made up of objects, artifacts, and artworks, through to national and international collections, which house thousands of objects, often intended for public display. This evening's event is focusing specifically on caring for collections and will provide a glimpse behind the curtain of some of the many various activities involved in this. Before I introduce this evening's chair, just a very quick housekeeping note. We will have the chat open throughout the event this evening, and please do share any thoughts, comments, or questions you might have with us there. Each of our speakers will be giving a short presentation, and then we'll have the opportunity for discussion afterwards. And we'd love to get to as many of your questions as we can and have your input in the discussion as well. So please do share them there. So it's now my absolute pleasure to introduce our chair for this evening. Rosemary Lynch was Director of Collection Care at Tate from 2013 to 2021. During which time she led the team responsible for caring for a national collection through a period of significant change, institutionally and globally. By profession, Rosemary is a librarian with over 30 years experience leading business innovation and cultural change across the arts, further and higher education sectors. She's also served on advisory boards for organisations and foundations, including Art 360 Foundation and Stonal. She worked closely with her colleagues during her time at Tate to build a division with the strength, vision and flexibility to find sustainable solutions to many challenges encountered every day while managing and preserving a dynamic collection and sharing it through Tate's worldwide programme. Her practice has always been rooted in her values of openness and collaboration, and she's committed to working in partnership with communities to open the arts and heritage to everyone. Rosemary, thank you so much for sharing this evening. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Acacia. Thank you for that lovely introduction and for developing this fascinating series of conversations for those of us who are fascinated by the seemingly endless possibilities of collections, whether they're private or public or personal, to inspire and connect individuals and communities across the world. A very warm welcome to everyone to tonight's event. We hope very much to benefit from your questions and ideas later during our question and answer session. But for the moment, may I invite you to give us a virtual round of applause for our three panelists tonight: Megan Narvey, Kathleen Lauther, and Marenka Thompson. Odlum, apologies, Marenka. As you know, Megan can't actually be with us in person tonight, but she will be cheering us on from Minnesota when we enjoy her pre-recorded presentation shortly. Tonight's topic is caring for collections. It's a huge topic, rich in history, in diversity, and in debate. For me, caring for collections encompasses many, many things, from the physical and technical challenges of storing and moving artworks and objects and preparing them for display, to the principles and ethics of collection management and care, aspects such as acquisition, conservation, documentation, labelling, access, huge topics, each and every one, to the value and meaning that society gives to specific objects at different times, and to the ways in which people can engage with and inform all of these important debates. Working in the field of collection care, practitioners give deep and continuous thought to these multiple questions and responsibilities, seeking always to balance our primary duty of care for objects so that they are preserved as appropriate for the long term, whilst making them as accessible as possible in the here and now. Much of this thought and the associated work that goes into caring for collections still happens behind the scenes in museums and galleries and other institutions. And I am delighted, therefore, to have the opportunity tonight to hear more about the hidden arts of caring for collections from our panelists, who bring rich and varied perspectives and experience to the table. We'll hear from each of them in turn and then have a chance to ask further questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker tonight, Megan Narvey. Megan is the Outreach Conservator at the Minnesota Historical Society. She has the twin advantages of being both a Master of Arts and a Master of Science in conservation. She has worked as a postgraduate fellow in object conservation at the Canadian Conservation Institute in Ottawa, Canada, and as objects conservator at the Western Archaeological and Conservation Center in Tucson, Arizona. And Megan is going to speak to us tonight about her work. Thank you, Acacia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Megan Narvey, and I work as the Outreach Conservator at the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul, Minnesota, in the United States. I was delighted to be invited to join this panel to talk a bit about the work I do to help care for collections around the state of Minnesota. Because this panel covers all sorts of different kinds of collections care, I thought I'd start by talking a bit about conservation. I've included on this slide a definition of conservation from ICON, which is the professional organization for conservators in the UK. But I think that conservation can be kind of squiggly to define. Traditionally, it's thought of as the field focused on the physical preservation of physical things. But over time, we recognize that you can't really separate the physical components of an object from its meanings and values. So it's a little complicated, but primarily the work of conservators is basically to limit the negative physical impacts of time on our cultural heritage. Conservators often talk about the 10 agents of deterioration. We are trained to identify these and remedy them if possible. Sometimes that involves treatment of items, like cleaning or repairing them, often in a conservation lab. But conservation can also work much more broadly by preventing these agents of deterioration from harming an object in the first place. It could be by managing the environment through controlling the temperature and humidity, or monitoring for pests, limiting light levels, using archival acid-free storage materials, all sorts of different preventive conservation techniques. Conservators are not the only people in the museum world who are concerned with and knowledgeable about the agents of deterioration, but you could say that it's our specialty. I work at the Minnesota Historical Society, which is a large organization with over 300 staff members. It was founded in 1849, which actually predates the state of Minnesota by nearly a decade. MNHS has a library, an archive, and 26 museums and historic sites all across the state. There are a large number of collection specialists who work here who manage the collection, including curators, collections managers, registrars, and conservators in 3 conservation labs. This is all very vast, but I have almost nothing to do with any of it. My role as outreach conservator is to be a resource for anyone other than the Minnesota Historical Society who is trying to preserve history in the state. I work within a department of different subject matter experts and grant specialists. We're all focused on helping people across the state who are doing history work. For those of you with less familiarity with the United States, here's a map showing the location of Minnesota. It's up north, bordering Canada, quite cold and snowy in the winter, and the summers tend to be hot and humid. In square kilometers, Minnesota is nearly the same size as the UK, but at 6 million people, we're only like 8% of the population. We have 11 federally recognized Native American tribes in Minnesota, including both Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples. And there are more than 500 museums, some of which are labeled on this map. But I help out more than just museums. I also work with universities, archives, libraries, local government, tribes, and even individuals. Most museums don't have the budget to keep a permanent conservator on staff. Of the 500 museums in Minnesota, I only know of 2 that do, including my own institution. It's not that conservation isn't important, it's just expensive and specialized. The most important aspect of conservation, which is preventing damage from occurring in the first place, it can be done by anybody if they have the resources they need. Resources like time, money, and knowledge. I can help in a couple of ways. I'm available as a free resource for people to ask questions, request meetings or site visits, and to do educational outreach like webinars and blog posts. I also work as a content reviewer for our grants office, which disperses state funding allocated for projects that preserve Minnesota's history and cultural heritage. It's extremely helpful to have these 2 functions side by side so that when I give an organization advice on steps they can take to improve the long-term preservation of their collection, I can also give them advice on how to fund those changes. The best part of my job is going on site visits. These are a couple pictures of local history museums I've visited as part of my job. Before the pandemic, I'd get a chance to visit an organization once or twice a week. These days, it doesn't happen as often. My colleagues and I will travel to every corner of the state, which can sometimes mean there's a lot of driving involved. Site visits for me are informal, usually about an hour or 2 in length, and then after our meeting, I'll follow up by email. My follow-up will usually include information and links to resources about things that we talked about. It could be information about grants. It could be contact information for other people that I think they should talk to. I have to think about what's achievable for this organization. What small things could they address that would have a big impact on the collection? It could be a small thing, like recommending that they hang up curtains. It could be that I give them advice on applying for a grant for a new HVAC system, or working on a complex project like a conservation survey. Here are a couple more pictures of site visits I've been on, showing the variety of things that I might go out to see. An important role that I play is to connect people to the right experts. I can give basic information on preserving painted walls, but I will also pass along the resources to connect with a professional paintings conservator for more complex questions or to talk about treatment. There are situations when I'm able to help with a museum environment, and there are situations when I help people find a mechanical engineer. As a conservator, seeing things in person is really crucial for me to get a good picture of what's going on. It's a lot harder for me to give advice based on photographs or phone calls. Another benefit is relationship building. It's important to me to be a trusted partner for local museums. I'm also regularly on the lookout for potential collections hazards. In this picture, you can see a jar full of an unknown food that was on display in a historic building. This is a hazard because of the potential for bacteria. Other hazards I've spotted recently include leaking engines, possible pesticide residue, unlabeled chemicals, and historic medicines. Occasionally, I get called out to help with a collections emergency. In emergencies, I try to make myself available in whatever way is most helpful and convenient. Sometimes we might help out with the immediate response. Other times we might come in to help an organization strategize about their long-term recovery. The picture on the right shows me giving a lesson on cleaning soot off of objects after a fire. I also spend a lot of time working on emergency preparedness for the organizations in the state, like encouraging more museums to write disaster plans and buy supplies for disaster response kits, and by networking and connecting organizations to help each other. The other major part of my job is working as a content reviewer for our grant program for any project that has to do with collections preservation, museum environments, and conservation. This includes coaching applicants through the application process, reviewing applications, and following up on funded projects through milestones and final reports. I sometimes give webinars where I discuss requirements for different grant types, and sometimes I get to go on site visits to see the work firsthand. This is a really, really rewarding part of my job because I get to help people accomplish their preservation goals, and I get to see so many exciting projects happening all across the state. I'll end my presentation with my introductory slide again. Please feel free to reach out with any questions or to connect. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Megan for what was an illuminating insight really into the power of connections across a vast territory to maximise expertise and enable people to help and support each other. I'd now like to turn to our next speaker, Kathleen. Kathleen Lauther is a freelance curator specialising in the documentation of museum collections. In the past 10 years, Kathleen has worked with a diverse range of collections, including social history, costume, fine art, and ethnographic collections, and in museums of all sizes. She has recently been awarded an Art Fund Headley Fellowship for a project working with the Pearl Cotton Museum in Kent, and I know she's hoping to mention that at some point during the evening as well. So thank you very much, and over to Kathleen.
Thank you, Rosemary. Okay, so I'm a collections cataloguer, and I also work as a consultant for institutions who want to improve the documentation of their collections. I've become interested in the history of how collections have been managed and how it shapes our practice today. So I want to talk about cataloguing as a practice of care, but I also want to talk about the level of care that is needed in our cataloguing practice. Cataloguing and documentation is all about recording everything that we know about an object. But it shouldn't just be about accumulating knowledge or demonstrating expertise for the sake of it. Collections records should be useful live documents that are vital to museums' ability to care for, preserve, and share what makes these objects meaningful. So I wanted to start by talking about cataloguing as care at its most basic level, with the purpose of managing the collections which the museum holds. Accredited museums in the UK are required to follow the Spectrum standards for collections documentation. This is a set of procedures, of which perhaps the most basic is inventory, knowing what you have, where it is, and how it came to be part of the collection. Around 1,700 of the 2,500 museums in the UK are accredited under the Arts Council's accreditation scheme, but that doesn't mean that these museums all have a detailed inventory of all the objects in collections and can prove that they own them. In fact, most of them don't, but it means that they can demonstrate that they are working towards these goals. So why is this basic documentation such a challenge for museums? If you think about the scale of some of these collections, our national museums and even some of the larger regional ones may have in excess of 1 million individual objects, which they will have acquired over decades or even hundreds of years. And they will have started with handwritten bound accession registers and then moved on to ever more complex systems of index cards and now computerized databases. And all of the things that were entered using those earlier methods will have to be transferred onto the computerized system, sometimes by way of spreadsheets and hastily jotted inventory lists. So there are many opportunities for human error and losing information along the way. The ongoing task of catching up with all of this documentation also raises ethical questions. should we be replicating the descriptions and categorizations of objects which were made 100 years ago? To understand these challenges, I think it's useful to go way back to look at how the systems we have managed for managing our collections have developed. The forerunners of the modern museum were the private collections of curiosities amassed during the Renaissance. These Wunderkammer seem cluttered and chaotic to our eyes, but they did have an order reflective of their purpose, for wealthy individuals to show off their worldliness and good taste. The first guide to managing these collections was written in 1565 by a man called Samuel Kieshberg, suggesting 5 categories of objects which were to be arranged with no hierarchy between them. But later, in the Enlightenment era, museums became institutional rather than domestic. The Ashmolean is the first example of this in Britain, opening in 1683. These spaces changed from being private to being nominally public, and the meaning of the collections within them changed too. This was a time of science and discovery, and museums became places where science was enacted and discoveries were made. So cabinets became laboratories and objects became specimens. The Enlightenment brought new ways of organizing the world and information about it, introducing standardized classifications of the natural world, which led to the corresponding development of race science categorizing people. All of this influenced museums, and their collections and records reflect this. Beginning in the 19th century, regional town councillors and local learned societies created their own museums. They were inspired by the Ashmolean, the British Museum, by the Great Exhibition of 1851, and by popular scientific pursuits of the day, such as natural history collecting and archaeology. The curatorial profession was emerging at the time, but most of the museum makers were enthusiasts volunteering their time rather than paid staff. And there was a civic dimension to these projects. These were mostly middle-class founders, intending that the museums would be places of education and improvement for working-class people. And this is perhaps the beginning of the idea of museums having a duty of care to their audiences, as well as their collections, but the approach was paternalistic and it enforced existing hierarchies. Within these museums, the working man could learn about science and art, but also about his perceived place in relation to other social classes and people from other cultures. And this was, of course, the height of British colonialism, and links to empire were not confined to London and to major cities and ports. Small regional museums often included within their founders and donors retired colonial administrators who had collections of objects from across the empire. And it was in this era that many aspects of museum documentation practice became entrenched. Influential collectors, such as Pitt Rivers, influenced the way the museums ordered and documented their collections, setting up paradigms that we're still unpicking today, as I'm sure we will hear from Marenka. There are subtle and not so subtle reminders still present in the documentation. For example, these 2 rather patronizing labels, which state how 2 different African cultures were seen to be merely imitating European objects and crafts. Moving on into the 20th century, there was, of course, massive social change at home and with the decolonization of empire. The breakdown in old ways contributed to a desire to preserve material culture with a focus on social history and a growing heritage industry that sought to preserve material from everyday people, as well as everything from country houses to industrial collections. And many museums have stores full of generic household items, which attest to this period. New types of objects were added to the collections at this time, but the way that they were described didn't radically change. However, the medium for managing that information did. Museum documentation practice in the later 20th century was largely taken up with the challenge of computerizing all of the paper records already created. And in many cases, these were transcribed verbatim, preserving the 19th century ideologies along the way. So these images are a detail of documentation of the same collections, one from the 19th century loan book, in the middle, a 1930s record of that loan being converted into a donation, which was itself part of backlog documentation work of the time, and then on the current database system. In the 21st century, there is a renewed increasing focus on audience and on museums having a duty of care not just to the objects, but to social causes, delivering well-being outcomes for their communities. With increased community engagement and more diverse representation in recent years, this is a positive outcome of this shift. And yet there has been a disconnect between community engagement and collections work. For example, sometimes when people from outside of the museum are asked to contribute to an exhibition, this information is not recorded in the permanent catalogue record for the objects. And it will therefore not be retained for the next generation of museum curators and visitors in the way that previous records have. And that is a failure of our duty of care to collections and communities. But rather than calling out examples of bad practice for this one, I have used an example from a project I worked on at Brighton Museum, which was called Fashioning Africa. And here in this image, my colleague Edith Ojo and I are installing an Asha Oke outfit, which she acquired for the museum's collections. On the project, I was the person responsible for documenting the collections, and I took great care to record the process and the decisions behind the collecting, Edith's reasons for collecting the specific items she did, the stories of the previous owners, and what the objects had meant to them. And there's a huge amount of work involved in adding all that additional information in, and that's something that I hope museums and funders will take into account going forward. So today, many people may question whether museum collections should be preserved in their current form, and whether we, meaning Western museum professionals, are the right ones to be looking after them. But even if the answer to these questions is no, there is still work to be done, which currently only the museum can do because of the way that they've set things up. I do believe that museums have a responsibility to get their basic documentation in order before they can make informed decisions about deaccessioning objects from their collections. And they cannot work towards restitution or repatriation if they do not have accurate information about where the objects come from. This slide shows gold weights from Ghana, which have come from at least 3 different individual collectors, which have historically been stored together at various times in their time in the museum, have been renumbered and relabeled and have got mixed up. So my job in this case was to properly inventory them, to go through all of the old paperwork and start to get everything back in order. Again, that's time-consuming work, and it requires great care and an understanding of the historic documentation process to get it right. So we do need to approach documentation work with care and with a critical eye, looking at whose expertise has been historically valued and recorded and whose has not, looking as well at who is responsible for describing and documenting objects currently and what biases they might bring. The most effective way to preserve collections, if that is what we mean by care, would be to keep them in as controlled an environment as possible, but that would mean they were never accessed and enjoyed. We can't care for our collections in a vacuum, and the same is true of collections information. It can't exist in a vacuum divorced from the real-world contexts in which the collections were acquired and catalogued. We need to be ready to share information about our objects and institutional histories. With our new digital systems, collections categories and assigned meanings do not have to be rigid. We can and should record multiple and conflicting views about objects, keeping a record of the problematic interpretations of the past in the interest of accountability and transparency. So it's not a case of erasing records that we now see as wrong, but about acknowledging that records are interpretations of our collections and that other interpretations are always possible. So I really whizzed through the history of collecting and cataloguing there, and I've included a couple of books if anyone's interested in reading more, because I find it to be a fascinating subject and I hope you would agree. Thank you.
Kathleen, thank you so much for that whistle-stop tour of the history of cataloguing. I certainly learned something, and also for reminding us really of the importance of historical context when determining cataloguing principles, which continues today, and for raising some important questions about the challenges of documentation, both from a practical perspective on ongoing challenges that we have, and also societal. And I know that's already raised some questions in the audience, which we'll pick up in the Q&A session. So thank you very much for that. I'd now like to move on to our last speaker today, and that's Marenka Thompson. Marenka is a research associate at the Pitt Rivers Museums and a doctoral candidate at the University of Glasgow. Her doctoral research explores Glasgow's role in the transatlantic slave trade through the material culture housed at Glasgow's museums. At the Pitt Rivers Museum, she is the researcher on the Labelling Matters project, which investigates the problematic use of language within museum spaces and ways of decolonisation through reimagining the definition of a label. So there's a challenge, and thank you very much. I'll hand over to Marenka to talk to us about it.
Thank you, Rosemary, and thank you, Kathleen, for setting up a great kind of intro as well into my talk. I am going to share my screen. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us again. And I'm Marenka, and as Rosemary said, I work at the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is one of the University of Oxford museums, and has, I guess, no one would argue, a very deep colonial history, as in many of the objects, not only the objects, but also the photos and manuscripts and archives associated with the museum that make over, over 500,000 objects as part of the collection. The majority of them were collected kind of during the height of the British colonial period. And so we have a lot to kind of reckon with in all aspects of our work, and for redress as well. So the Labelling Matters project specifically started in 2019. It was originally supposed to be a one-year project. 3 years later, I'm still here, just to go to show you the vast amount of work to be done. And it was envisioned as kind of initially to do a survey or review of all the interpretation and labeling within the museum space. So when I say that, I mean the physical space, what's on display, but also within our database and our websites. So how any of that could have been done in 1 year is beyond me. But since then, it's kind of grown from there as well. And so I'm going to literally whiz through, the Labelling Matters project to you and how I think it talks to the idea of caring for collections. So the image you see right now is actually a new commission by the museum from a Hawaiian artist called Solomon Enos. It's a series of 16 paintings. And I know you're wondering, how did I go from Labelling Matters to kind of these insect hybrid creatures? I promise I'll get there. I'm kind of almost starting at the end of my talk and working backwards. So as I said, these images, you see the series of 16, currently where you're seeing them, they're all laid out in the collections office at the Pitt Rivers Museum, waiting to be displayed. And as I said, they are a series of 16 paintings of all of these characters are insects that are endemic to Hawaii. And if anybody knows a lot about Hawaii, there's actually a really big problem of endangerment of species. So it's also kind of pointing to that, because Solomon is a very big environmental activist as well. But also these paintings are actually directly kind of influenced or from the Labelling Matters project. So from looking and surveying the labels, we actually got this series of paintings, and I'm going to kind of break that down a little bit more. As you can see, I said each of these, this is one of the rough sketches, or the first sketches that Saul did, but also what he did was I sent him basically the entire catalog of Hawaiian objects that we have, which was kind of like a 400-page like PDF that I exported from the database. And he used all the objects that you can see on the right, the kapa, the bark cloth, and the kapa beaters and the gourds, and incorporated them into each of each of the characters that he created. But what he also did was he took one step further, and this is actually a screenshot of his Instagram, which was all, and this was also on the Pitt Rivers Instagram. But the text that you see is actually what will go into our database as the interpretation for each of those paintings. And yes, some of them are kind of lengthy, some of them aren't, but what is really, what I want to draw your attention to is that each of them, it's not just an interpretation, it's a narrative that fits each character, but more importantly, brings to life the objects that kind of inspired each character from the collection. And so instead of this kind of very neutral, supposedly objective third-person voice kind of telling you this technical breakdown of what you're looking at, here Saul has actually created an entire narrative around how they would be used, their importance to his community. So here specifically, we're looking at the uli uli, which are the feather rattles that you see the sacred dancer, which is the name of this character, holding. And this is modeled after a moth that is endemic to Hawaii. And what I love about this is that it's only by kind of working so closely with someone, like you could get this line. This line is from part of the interpretation. He says, the role of this sacred dancer is as important as the community's weavers and kappa makers, for the fabric of reality also needs frequent upkeep. And to some, this may not seem as something that should go on a label or an interpretation, but I think that if I were to ever have written this as a curator, written a text to go with this image myself, I would have never come up with something that fundamentally understands, the connection between hula, so dance, melee, song, nature, and the uli, so the rattles and the spiritual, and how they all intertwine, because that is not something that I could understand it on a kind of on one level, but nothing that would ever allow me to come up with that line, for the fabric of reality also needs frequent upkeep. But more important, but also what I love about this is that because we posted all the narratives that will also go on display in the museum, we posted them on Instagram, and also with Saul, in conjunction with Saul, is that we got so much feedback, not just from people who kind of follow the Pit Rivers, but also people who follow like Saul and a lot of the Hawaiian community. So all the comments, and they kept on adding more and more layers that I would love to further down as a project, kind of bring those ideas together to see how those kind of almost enrich like Saul's series, and all these ideas. People ask, like, I wonder what it would be like to play a rattle with 4 arms. And someone wanted to kind of think about that, how would it sound different? What it would be like, how it would affect your movement when dancing. And all these kind of questions that were like, oh, these are really interesting things to go down. But yes, how did we arrive from labeling matters and looking at problematic, often colonial language in the Pit Rivers Museum, to insect hybrid fabric of reality beings? So simply, well, I say simply, not so simply, one of the first things we started the Labeling Matters project that had to be done was to think about how to identify the issues in our interpretation and our labeling. And in Kathleen's talk, we saw quite a few problematic labels, but some of them are very easy to kind of spot. They have very derogatory language that create that we shouldn't be using, but also there are ones that are more euphemistic, ones that are harder to kind of unpick because we are so entrenched in a way of thinking that sometimes we can't see clearly how the damage that these labels are doing, how they are reinforcing, colonial ideologies. So basically, based on decolonial theory, I just asked myself these 3 questions while I systematically went through all the display cases and all the very, very tiny, tiny labels. And one is, does this label or display establish hierarchies? So hierarchies could be, along kind of ethnic or racial lines, gender, labor, often all those things intersect, so they're not mutually exclusive. So does any of the language establish or reinforce those hierarchies? Does it assign power and privilege to Eurocentric knowledge, which Kathleen also just touched upon? And does it impose Eurocentric culture? And so kind of asking myself those 3 things as I went along kind of really started to kind of break things down. And I'm going to kind of show you how examples of this. So first with hierarchy, this one was kind of done with the methods of making fire case. And as you can see, as I said, a lot of the language is still from the original labeling from the late 19th century. So very problematic. But what you kind of also see is that how we talk about some words are always assigned to only specific cultural groups or spaces. So for example, in that case, you get the term modern used quite a bit, but overwhelmingly, the word was associated with Europe. The same with, it's not on this one, it's on separate, but the word tribe would be used. Now the word tribe in itself, not wholly problematic, but the way that it's used in the museum space was extremely problematic. You know, tribe would be used in almost every other continent, but to describe cultural groups from Europe, yet again. So kind of creating this hierarchy, but also within this methods of making fire case, what became really clear was that a lot of the words used, like simple, was supposed about simple technology. So rubbing like fire sticks together to make fire, for example, because it was mainly fire sticks in this case. But it was always spoken about when fire sticks for Europe were always spoken about in the sense of being only used for ceremonial purposes, while only used for survival purposes in places like, for example, sub-Saharan Africa or amongst Aboriginal Australians or different parts of the world, you know, again, kind of reinforcing this idea of hierarchy. And, you know, and one of the things that's really great in this, the QR code here actually links to a video by the Maasai delegation that visited Pitt Rivers in 2020. And it really captures basically Amos and Yannick talking about one of the fire sticks in the case, in which they talk about the ceremonial purpose of the fire stick and how it lights the homes of all the next political cohort. And so they kind of really destroy that whole idea of, you know, using quote unquote simple technology for only survival purposes. I know I don't have much time, so I'm going to race through. Knowledge, as I said, about establishing kind of things that perpetuate Eurocentric types of knowledge only. For example, is the opium case in the museum. In the center is the label that starts opium is a legal narcotic. Of course, this is really interesting because one, it suggests that legality is a universal concept. You know, it doesn't say where opium is a legal narcotic. It also is very value laden, doesn't take into kind of consideration the entire like history of opium poppy use. It mainly only focuses on China and doesn't look at the global history of opium, even though the objects in that case are from all over the world. But also it wants to focus on China, but doesn't talk about the opium wars once, even though all the objects there were mainly collected during that period of British sanctioned opium trade. So what narrative is it saying? And to kind of counter that, we have accessible again through QR codes are two videos, one by Hong Kong-based artist Royce Ng called Empire of Opium, which is a video essay that almost kind of charts his whole like look at understanding from this one statue in Manhattan back to Hong Kong and kind of the history of opium and the opium wars that he as someone who actually grew up in Australia had no concept of, and then by going back to Hong Kong, that kind of opened up his eyes. And then we also have the image below is from a film by Dr. Fiona Foley, who's an Aboriginal Australian researcher and artist. And it looks at actually like the effects on the opium sanction trade on the Indigenous people of Australia as well. And it's really a beautiful, you can see it on our website, display and telling of a story that I would have never actually thought, based on our label, I would have never thought, wait, that also impacted, you know, these cultural groups as well. Next. And culture. So this takes us right back to Hawaii and how we ended up with this. And this is from the feather cloak case, so beautiful Hawaiian feather cloak. And it really outlines a lot of the issues with our Hawaiian, how we talk about Hawaiian collections and greater Polynesian collections. And one, it is that it's all very male-centric. You know, it talks about Kea Kalui, who she gave this cloak to the wife of Sir George Simpson, who was the head of the Hudson Bay, but his wife's name is not mentioned. She was Frances Simpson. And Ke'e'ekele is talked about as the lady premier of King Kamehameha III. And even in later, the bequest and the provenance talk about all the female donors as Mrs. Ross Hayden or Mrs. George, H.D. Beasley. Again, all in relation to men, but also they talk about the Hawaiian feather cloaks as well, as we talk about as only being in the realm of men, while it's not true, because this cloak was given by a woman of very high standing to another woman. We have images of Queen Liliuokalani, the last queen of Hawaii, standing with, Hawaiian cloak draped at the back of her throne. We have these few instances that kind of disrupt this very kind of distinct idea that we have spoken about, these ideas of gender that we have created and placed upon this feather cloak. And so when thinking about the Hawaiian collections, again, I came up with these things by looking at hierarchies, knowledge, and culture. It was three things became really clear to me. One, it was very focused, male focused, everything that we talked about in the museum. Two, we talked about kind of Hawaii as being this very isolated cosmology instead of actually what is an epic cosmology. These insects, these Saul's kind of insect creatures are actually inspired by an epic tale of Hiaka, that partly takes part in the subterranean world. And within that, in that tale, it's this kind of epic adventure and understanding of a space that is not just kind of isolated. Isolated to the fact that, like, in our labeling, we call them islanders, and we call Cook and his entourage, Captain Cook, voyagers. And there's a reason why, how can you call Cook and his crew voyagers, but not call people from that Pacific region also voyagers? It's just kind of ridiculous. So it was really important then, having these conversations with Saul. Then he created these works to kind of show, well, actually, everyone's role in the community was important. As he said, the sacred dancer upkeeps the fabric of reality. But more importantly, it kind of showed how the vast idea of understanding of their space and their world and that region of not just being only islands, but the entire kind of Pacific region as well. And so kind of by breaking down those labels and coming up with the ideas that actually this is really problematic how we speak about these people, these cultural groups and these artworks, then we could, and working with Saul, we were able to, basically he was able to create something that was much more personal, he used all his narratives that he uses Hawaiian language as well. He also shows us how these objects would have been held, transported, used. And to me, I think that is very much what caring is about, because I often have an issue with the word care, because we can often think we're caring for things, but caring from our worldview, what we think good care is, and my idea of care for an object might not be someone else's, the source community's idea of caring for an object. And so it's about, for me, giving up that control. So the interpretation wasn't by me, but by an entire community, basically. And I'm going to stop there. Sorry, I went over.
Marenka, thank you so much. And you've covered so much ground. I don't think we quite know where to start, but there are definitely questions coming in, and building also on the presentations that came earlier. So thank you for that. One of the questions, just to kickstart it, was quite an interesting question about, isn't the Insect project about outreach and audience building rather than care? So beyond Tate's remit, and that beyond today's remit, Tate's in my mind still. And actually that's interesting, because one of the questions I was going to ask all of you, and Megan can't answer now, but you're both here, is about what does caring for a collection actually mean to you? You've touched on this a little bit, but I think it also addresses this question about why it's important to include it in tonight's discussion. So Marenka, perhaps you'd like to kick off from responding to that, and Kathleen to come in as well before we move on. Thank you.
I guess caring for a collection to me is, well, one, partly, which is going to be a little bit controversial, no, but is to sometimes, I think we have to not forget, but put aside sometimes this idea of permanence. I know that's sometimes like at the core of a lot of museum work. You know, we do everything to make it last for future generations, for the, you know, that's kind of the idea. And I understand that, but especially when you're working in an ethnographic museum, for example, that isn't actually at the core of care for a lot of the objects that we work with. So it's kind of, you have to decide as an institution, then what kind of care do you want to do? Do you want to do care from what you've almost been trained to do your entire life? Or if you say you want to kind of start for the Pitt Rivers, decolonize the museum and be more collaborative, does that mean that care is looking to, you know, source communities, diaspora communities, and what that means, and how then you can work towards that? For example, some Hawaiian quilters are making these, I think, 8 quilts for us. They should be here anytime soon. You know, one of the things they keep on saying is like, you have to sleep under them for one night before they kind of go into the museum. To them, that's care, right? But that's something that's completely the antithesis of what we'd ever think about. You know, when you commission a piece, you're not gonna like sleep under it. Or
I think it's wonderful to open up the definition of care, and I liked also Megan's earlier word that, you know, like conservation is squiggly, and this whole notion of care is squiggly in that way. But also I think it goes back to what is the core purpose, as you say, of the work that you're doing, which varies hugely across our public, private sector, massively so. So I think really interesting. And Kathleen, would you like to add anything to what care means for you?
Yeah, sure. I think that my attitude and understanding towards care has changed a lot in my work, because when I first started working with collections, I was very much doing the practical collections management side. And as I saw how a lot of museums do struggle to document all of their collections, I was thinking, well, you can't be caring for them if you haven't properly documented them. But then as I progressed and started working with different types of collections and getting into seeing all of that historic documentation, that's when I started to, you know, just notice all of these problematic things that had somehow, in some ways, had kind of slipped through the net, like people had just kind of accepted them and reproduced them again and again without kind of taking that care over them. So that's kind of the journey that I've taken from being into the practical side to then thinking about what ideologies we are perpetuating if we continue in that way.
Thank you, Kathleen. And I think it's really important to kind of explore this huge spectrum of what it means to truly care for collections and for objects. I'm going to move on to a question about unpicking past paradigms, which has come up. And the question is, why must we unpick past paradigms, as opposed to recognizing that paradigms were of their time and context, and that as times change, so do paradigms. Times change and we change within them. That's the question. So Kathleen, maybe you'd like to respond to that first.
I can kick off with that. I mean, I agree that paradigms do change over time, and that, but I think when I don't know if it was me that used the word unpick. Again, it's that tension between the practical side and the kind of ideological side. When I say unpicking documentation, sometimes I mean finding out which description goes with which object and which collector contributed it, and unpicking it in that sense to properly connect everything up. I don't think we need to remove paradigms or things that reflect paradigms that we find to be problematic, but I think that we do need to acknowledge them and acknowledge that they are of their time. So if you've got an old label, it might be appropriate to reproduce it, but to put it in its context and make it clear when it was created. And I think that's probably the way forward, but it is again, it's always just a lot of work to constantly be reframing things like that.
Thank you, Kathleen. And Marenka, can you say something about that, you know, where the focus perhaps should lie on past, present, or future?
Yep, sure. I mean, I completely agree with Kathleen about it's not about kind of hiding those, you know, past labels that reflect those like past paradigms. You need to use them, you know, as almost teaching tools, which is what kind of we hope to do in the Labeling Matters project a lot. But I think we do need to kind of deconstruct them, because even though they might be what we think in the past, you know, what a lot of my like work in the museum has taught me is that even though our language has changed and our ideas have shifted, actually a lot of the underlying ideology is really hard to get rid of, and it still kind of bubbles up, and it might bubble up in a different word that seems less offensive, or in our everyday life might not even seem offensive at all, but it actually is very much kind of creating you know, those hierarchies. I mean, I'm just going to give a really brief example. I know we don't have time, but for example, we have this one case that I guess when the museum was founded, would have said human form in savage art, and the other one would be human form in civilized art, right? Of course, no one would use the word savage today, at least not in that context. You might use it on like Twitter for something. But as you look at how it changes throughout, you know, the 100 and something years history of the museum, or more than that, I don't know. But you see changes from that to evolution of human form in art to degradation of human form in art. Then it changes to human form in folk art, then human form in tribal art. And, you know, slowly like the wording changes to something that's like kind of more recognizable to what we might use today, but actually the underlying idea is still there, because all the objects that were in the human form in civilized art to begin with are from specific regions of the world or specific places that are termed Western civilization. And the savage art one was everybody else. And so I think we need to understand, like, you know, that sometimes we still unconsciously do that. And so by only deconstructing them, we can be able to make sure we don't repeat those things in the future, or at least try not to.
So it's important both, I mean, from all aspects, the kind of practical side, as we talked about documentation, we need to get the basics right, but we need to evolve over time, and we need to be interpreting and reinterpreting things in order to inform our present and future, I think is what we're saying collectively. The past is important to this. We are almost out of time, but if you're happy, we'll stay on for another 5 minutes, because there are some questions that are in the chat that I'd like to pick up on if I can. One is about community consultation and collaboration, and how do you both go about updating collections, documentation and labels? The question is, do you work directly with members of originating cultural groups to document objects? And it would be nice also to get Megan's view. She's not here, but she may well add something afterwards. So Kathleen, maybe do you want to start on this one?
Yeah, so I have worked on a couple of projects which did that, notably one called Making African Connections, which I was working for Brighton Museum, and we worked with a museum or two museums in Botswana. But partly what my role as the documentation person on it was to get the records to that basic level where there would be enough information that it would be worth sharing with our partners. So we started before the pandemic, but obviously in 2020 COVID hit, and a lot of what we were doing was sharing things online and sending documents back and forth. So I had to get the records at a practical level where there would be enough information that people would be able to recognize and then share their knowledge back. But that was a fantastic experience, because our partners in Botswana and also some in the UK who had cultural knowledge of those objects were able to give us incredible perspectives on them that 5 generations of museum curators hadn't been able to. So
thank you very much. And Marenka, I'm sure you can add to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that would almost be kind of at the center of most of my practice, at least. And I mean, and not just mine, but the museum in our museum in general, that's like the direction that it's moving in. And I mean, I think that is actually one of the main reasons why the Labeling Matters project went from 1 year to more years and is still growing with no end in sight, because one of after like my first week in the museum, I clearly said, you know, nothing, we can do a review and a survey about the problematic language, but you know, it's not gonna change anything if the same people who've been here forever, or even me, who's someone who doesn't have, you know, the background of every single cultural group in the world, and that knowledge, just sits and rewrites these labels. That's not the point, right? We're just gonna be reiterating the same mistakes of the past. So it takes a lot of time, because when you have basically every single country represented in the museum, except for Liechtenstein, Paul Liechtenstein's not in the museum, then that means you have to work at establishing community connections and links, which we've done a lot. But again, there are, you know, it's 500,000, you know, things make up the collection. And so I think that's, people we want to rush. We want something that's fast. You know, people come and be like, oh, why haven't you changed all the labels in the museum yet? And I was just like, well, because we're actually trying to do this right, you know, and quickly, because my thing is always, we as an institution have caused so much harm and hurt to people in the past. I don't want anything that I do in the future, which I can't always control, and it's probably happened, but I'm going to try my best to make sure that we don't cause any more harm going forward. And so, yeah, so that's why we work with communities all around the world, try really hard, but again, it takes time. You can't expect people to want to work with you, you know, you have to kind of establish that relationship, which is even harder when you're doing it all through Zoom, as we've all done, you know, in the last like 2 years. And so it takes patience and, you know, humility, and being like, you are not the expert. And so, yeah, don't know if that answered the question.
No, I think it does, and I think it, you know, it points back also to that notion of trying to, you know, be trusted advisors, but you know, that Megan brought up in her talk, and that where specialists can offer trusted advice, but actually benefit so much as well, and need so much as well, all of that information. So how do we, you know, reach out to people, engage people, and how important that is to the whole concept of caring for collections. It's a sort of different and wider concept, I think, of caring for collections that we're discussing here tonight. With just a couple of minutes left, there's a totally different question, a few questions actually around this, where people have been inspired by your presentations tonight, and are asking really about your career trajectories, and wondering if you had any advice or tips to build people who are at the very early stages of their career, perhaps students or working voluntarily in museums. Any advice, tips to build their skills, gain experience to reach their dream of becoming conservators and collection care people? So that's quite a nice one perhaps to end on. So I'll ask you both. Marenka, perhaps you can start, and then Kathleen.
Sure. Ooh. This is a tough one. I guess I would start with one, you have to kind of grab any opportunity you see and run with it, because nobody's handing out anything, like literally, like you have to, it's just, even if you're in an institution already where you work like I am, you know, there are all these opportunities that come up, but I see time and time again, so many people don't actually say, oh, I should apply, or I should try, this is going to be better. And you kind of just start to be stagnant in your role and don't get, you know, don't kind of grow. So anything that you see comes your way that you think might be a possibility, just like literally go for it. But also, so one of the things I found that's really helped me is just doing a lot of things with public engagement. And I know often, especially sometimes in more curatorial roles, you don't actually get that as much because you didn't have a public engagement department. But that's actually where I find kind of the most opportunities and inspiration, is by, you know, I'm always in the public engagement team's office. I'm always like saying, oh, can I help out with this? Even if it's on a weekend, maybe like I'll take a Saturday and can I do this? And that's where you make most links, you're actually first seeing the communities that you're serving coming in, you're talking to them. They give you all these ideas and you're like, oh, this would be great. And then you end up doing a podcast with like, yes, year 12 students at like a local school, or all these different things. And so I think that, and I know being like public engagement is not for everybody, but I think it's very worthwhile, you know, being out there, being seen and being part, and you also gain a lot more trust from people by being willing to partake in things with them. And so that will also kind of give you more opportunities and help you build skills. And again, because that's where a lot of this is moving forward too. So you should do that. Sorry.
No, thank you. That's a great answer. I love it. Kathleen, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's important to, you know, take what opportunities are out there, because there are, you know, as we know, it is very competitive. There are few roles. So I don't feel like I had a set career path in mind. I kind of did what was available to me, which ended up being lots of documentation roles. But from that, I found a niche and found something that I was really interested and passionate about. So yeah, I would say take what opportunities are there and, you know, make the most of it.
Thank you very much. So I think, you know, the theme tonight is very much about connections, relationships, being kind and open, and being very, very expansive and broad, actually, I think, in exploring what we mean in caring for collections today. And thank you so much for your contributions. I've really enjoyed it. I'm sorry we haven't had enough time to answer all of the questions that are starting to come through. I think we could have covered, you know, we needed an hour or so or more for each of the topics, really, but hopefully that just means there'll be more opportunities in the future to explore them. So thank you both very much. Thank you, Megan in her absence, and may I hand back to Acacia to finish up for tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosemary, and thank you so much, Marenka and Kathleen, and to Megan for your wonderful presentations. As Rosemary said, I feel like we could have easily filled another hour just with the questions, but it was really wonderful to sort of get a little insight into what it is that you both do sort of day to day, and how that's really expanding the idea of what it means to care for a collection. So I'd also like to thank again our supporter for this evening and for this series of events, Lawrence Cesale Associates Incorporated, a visual arts advisory company. And thank you so much to the audience as well for some really insightful and generative questions there too. Our next event is going to be taking place on Zoom again on the 8th of February, and we will be talking to Rose Lejeune about collecting performance art. So quite different topic for us. There's more information on the research forums What's On page where you can register for the event, and we hope that we'll be able to see a lot of you there for that as well. So thank you again so much, Rosemary, Marenka and Kathleen, for joining us this evening, and to everyone who's been joining us at home, and we will hopefully see you at another event soon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.